Welcome to another Mesa Talk, proudly presented by the Mesa Prieta Petroglyph Project in partnership with Los Luceros Historic Site. We are pleased tonight to present Severin Fowles from Barnard, which is a part of the Columbia University system. But first, we have a couple of announcements. Mesa Prieta would, of course, like to thank our generous donors for your continued support throughout this pandemic in keeping our program going. Particularly, we want to thank Tosh Wells. So thank you, Tosh, for your generous gift and for your substantial contribution to preservation, recording, and education. Carly, I think you had a couple of announcements as well.
Sure do. Hi, everybody. My name is Carly. I'm coming from Los Luceros Historic Site. And I just wanted to announce that we are currently in the middle of our fall harvest days here. So that means Thursday through Sunday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. You can come and pick apples with your family. It's $7 per adult. Children 16 and under are free. And that will go until, mid-October, so October 17th, or until the apples are gone. Lastly, October 3rd, which is this upcoming Sunday, is our dawn till dusk day, meaning that we are open extended hours. So I believe it's 7:30 to 6 or 6:30 to 6:30, but I'll confirm that with you. But it's extended hours, and New Mexico residents get in for free. So it's a really good opportunity to come enjoy Los Luceros Historic Site for free. That's all the announcements I have. Enjoy the talk.
Thank you, Thank you, Carly. All right. So now I am joined here by, if you'll excuse me, my view has changed a little bit. There we go. Nope. Don't worry, they can't see me fumbling here. So, I don't know why it's doing side by side. It shouldn't be. Excuse me, folks. Sorry, Carly, I gotta do this. Oh. Okay. Now, we're ready. All right, I'm here with Professor Severin Fowles from Barnard College. Sev, I understand you'll be talking about Athabascan rock images from the first few centuries post-contact. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct.
All right. So do you want to introduce us to the topic and then take it away?
Righto. Okay. Thanks very much. Hi, everyone. If there's anyone out there, I can't really tell from my view. But I'm Sev Fowles. I'm here in Lenape land in New York City. Happy to be in conversation with you tonight about ancestral Hickory Apache land up in the northern Rio Grande, where my heart is all of the time, and I wish I was right now. The idea of picking apples together out there just sounded super. Anyway, I'm going to share some thoughts today about Athabascan rock art, Southern Athabascan rock art. But before I dive into the presentation, I do want to thank Chester and Carly for putting this all together. That's really a great opportunity to be with you. I want to thank the Mesa Prieta Petroglyph Project for all the kind of work they do to preserve and to protect the archaeological heritage in the part of the world that I think about all the time. And there are a couple other personal sort of thank yous I want to offer. First is to Veronica Tiller, who's a really important Hickory Apache historian, someone who has served as an important mentor to me. She stands behind some of the comments that I'm going to make tonight. She's not responsible for them, but she's helped, guide me in my thoughts about the Athabascan history of the northern Rio Grande. I want to thank Sunday Eiselt someone who has really written the book literally on the archaeology of the Apache in the northern Rio Grande. I'm really grateful for her friendship and guidance. And then my collaborators. I'm going to be sharing with you images from the Rio Grande Gorge that are produced via the labor of many, many students and colleagues, but in particular, my conspirators and co-directors, Lindsay Montgomery from the University of Arizona, Gerald Wilkinson from Dartmouth College, and Ben Alberti from Framingham State University. So those are my starting thank yous. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. And Chester, can you see that okay? All right, well, let's get to it. Title of my talk tonight, Borderland Images of Athabaskan, New Mexico, 1600 to 1900. There's lots of different ways of thinking about New Mexico and its history. From an Athabaskan perspective is one important one, as I hope you'll gather in my comments from my comments tonight. The talk is going to have 4 parts. We'll see if we can get through all 4 of them. The first is going to be a real quick overview of Southern Athabaskan history prior to 1600. I want to lay the groundwork by looking at the history of the Apache in the American Southwest prior to the onset of Spanish settler colonialism. So we'll very briefly run through some of the research that's been conducted on that lately. The second part's going to be even briefer. I'm going to say a few words about European colonialism as an aesthetic undertaking. So I'm really interested not just in all of the guns, germs, and steel and whatnot that were brought by the Europeans to the Southwest, but I'm also interested in the images that they brought and introduced. So this question of aesthetics is going to be crucial to what comes next in part 3, which is the key part of my talk tonight, Apache rock art. Many of you may have seen Apache rock art and not realized it. We're still working to define what Apache rock art is, what its variability is. I'm going to share some images that are born of my labors to try and answer that question of what Apache rock art looks like north of the Mesa Prieta area. But I'm going to be really interested in this question of European influence and how Athapaskan speakers, the Apache in particular, creatively used some of the Spanish images that were being introduced during the 17th century. 2 kinds of images in particular, I think are really important for us to consider. Military images, the sorts of things that were born of the collaborations and conflicts between indigenous and settler communities, and religious imagery, of course, Catholicism, introduced by the Spanish early on, which had a real big impact on many native groups. Military imagery I'm going to talk about in terms of an indigenous development of the Plains biographic tradition, drawing from the important work of Jim Keyser. And the religious imagery I'm going to discuss in terms of the mountain spirit tradition, which is a longstanding important tradition within Apachean worlds. And then I'll offer some brief closing thoughts at the end. We'll see if I have time for those. Okay, let's get started. Southern Athabascan history prior to 1600. We refer to the Apache and Navajo as the Southern Athapaskans, and this is one of those maps with linguistic distributions from the time of contact, highly speculative in many respects, but nevertheless, pink blobs are meant to represent some of the dominant areas that folks speaking an Athabaskan language, Apache or Navajo, were hanging out when the Spanish invaded. But we refer to them as Southern Athabascan because they're related to a much larger distribution of Northern Athabascan languages that are to be found in Alaska and Northwest Canada. And that relationship between that distribution of Athabascan languages across the continent has been the source of a lot of real interesting historical questioning. How did this happen? How did we have this pocket of Athabascan speakers far down to the south? Well, I won't go into the linguistic data, but suffice it to say that the diversity of Athabascan language groups in the far northwest is much larger. It's a more diverse set of Athabascan languages. It seems to have much deeper antiquity. The idea here is that there was at some point in the Athabascan past a great migration of folks from that northern homeland down into our area in the American Southwest. Now, many people debate the nature and the unfolding of this great migration. I want to give you just a few bits of information to help guide us in our thought about how this might have happened. It's relevant to our interpretation of the images that we'll look at shortly. Many have become interested in the way environmental changes have pushed people around on the landscape for obvious reasons. We stand in the midst of a great climate crisis where we're being pushed around. But if we go back to shortly after 800 CE, we encounter a big environmental disruption in the northwest portion of the continent, the eruption of Mount Churchill, which sent ash and pumice clasts careening down on the landscape all over northwest Canada. And as it did, it surely moved folks around. There's actually quite a bit of radiocarbon study of the degree to which this eruption moved people around the landscape. And this being a kind of heartland of Athapaskan speakers, there's no question that some of those ancestral Athabascan folks moved out of the way of this big disruption, moving south, moving east, perhaps even beginning the long migration down into New Mexico and Arizona. So perhaps this is a story that begins all the way back in the 9th century CE. But one of the other curious aspects of this history is the big gap that exists between that northern Athabascan group and the southern Athabaskans. So if we're to imagine that there was at some point in the past a movement south, why didn't they stop along the way? Why this great leap into the area that is we think of as a Pueblo zone? Well, we can look to the archaeological evidence to think about how they moved down through this area and what that timing might have been. Some really important work by Jack Ives and his colleagues at Promontory Caves is breathing new light into Julian Stewart's early excavations and really presenting us with this compelling image of Athabaskans already in the 13th century in Utah, in northern Utah. This is based on the evidence of these extraordinary moccasins that were found very well preserved in cave settings that really link that population, that 13th century population, to a distinctive northern Athabascan source. We can look out on the Front Range. A variety of archaeological excavations out there have made a compelling case for Athabascan presence during the 14th century. I won't go into the details there. My own work has looked at this question of Athabascan movement into the Southwest from the evidence in the Taos district. And there, I've really made the argument, along with my good friend and colleague Sunday Eiselt, that already by the late 1200s, in the Pueblo area itself, we can see evidence of an Athabascan presence. This amplifies some of the claims that Denny Seymour has made in other parts of the Southwest. Okay, so we have, I'll say more about the Taos evidence in just a moment, but the question still remains, why didn't they stop and settle down en route? Why this big gap between the northern Athabascan speakers and the southern? Well, to answer that question, I think we need to complicate this map and add a few other linguistic distributions from other groups. Here, I'm drawing your attention to the distribution of Numic speaking communities. Here, we're thinking about the Ute, the Shoshone, the Paiute, the Comanche. These are all Numic speaking peoples. They're linguistically related. And at the time of Spanish contact, they occupied a very large area throughout the Great Basin and Rocky Mountains, spilling out onto the Front Range. There's a lot of debate about Numic history and its movement throughout this area. Most scholars think that by 1300, by the 14th century, Numic speakers were established in much of this core area. Indeed, some scholars have proposed, and this is much debated, that there was a genesis of the Numic-speaking community in southeastern California that spread across the Great Basin into the Rockies. I won't go into the debates surrounding that. For my purposes, it's more significant to acknowledge that the Numic speakers really were an expansionistic coalition of communities. We know this from the early colonial period, that they were actively pushing out into neighboring areas, onto the northern plains, out onto the southern plains. That southern light blue blob there actually represents the movement of the Comanche, one of the Numic speaking communities, out onto the southern plains in the early 18th century. So there was this other expansionistic group moving through this core area in between the northern Athabascan range and the southern Athabascan range. And we often think about the dynamics of borderlands and the confrontation between different peoples, the sharing of ideas, the conflicts that go with that. We think about that as a colonial phenomenon so frequently. And we forget that during pre-colonial times, there were a lot of people moving around, bumping into one another, oftentimes allied, at other times in conflict with one another. And so I really want us to think about this late pre-colonial period, let's say during the 15th century, late 14th and 15th century, as a pre-colonial borderlands in its own right, defined by interactions between Athabaskan speakers, Numic speakers, and the great range of Pueblo communities just on the southern edge of this portion of land I'm interested in. The Pueblo speakers, of course, being members of many different linguistic families. Okay, so a borderland. And I think there was a whole lot of important history that happened before the Spanish ever showed up to write down what they thought was going on. I take particular significance in the fact that from the very first documents we have of, say, the interactions between the Comanche and the Apache, they were recorded as, deep and eternal enemies of one another. There had been an animosity built up over, it seems like, centuries. I wonder how much of that animosity actually has a history of conflict that came during the 14th and 15th century as Numic speakers and Athabascan speakers were crashing into one another in the Great Basin and Rocky Mountains. Be that as it may, there's no better place to think about this late pre-colonial borderlands world than in the Taos Pueblo region itself, which lies right at the intersection of the traditional Numic range and the traditional Athabascan, southern Athabascan range, and right up there in the northeastern corner of the Puebloan world. You all know Taos, I am sure. This is an image from the late 19th century. It was a very important trade center. It was a cosmopolitan space where folks from across the American West gathered to trade their wares during the early colonial period. So this seems to have been in place. Taos is, central functioning as a trade center already by the arrival of the Spanish. It's a place where ideas and styles and information was clearly traded and shared, where marriages were, arranged between peoples of different backgrounds. Here you're looking at two images. On the left-hand side, an image of a Hickory Apache leader from the 1880s. This is Chief Jose Martin. On the right-hand side, I apologize that I'm going to be mispronouncing his name, but Governor Waso To Yamin from Taos Pueblos. This is an 1877 image. One Hickory, one Taos Pueblo. They're dressed extremely similarly. Culturally, in terms of their material culture, they are one people. And this is the kind of insight that Dr. Tiller has really helped me think about, the close and long-standing connections between the Hickory Apache and not just Taos Pueblo, but Piccary's Pueblo as well, the other southern Tiwa-speaking Pueblo up in that portion of the Southwest. I want to add to that obvious insight that they shared stylistic elements one with the other, and also the clear indication that they were intermarrying throughout all recorded periods of time in the Southwest history. I want to add to that some information that was recorded by Matilda Cox Stevenson during her ethnographic work at Taos Pueblo in 1906. Stevenson spent a couple of years working at Taos Pueblo. It was a controversial set of notes that she recorded. I'm not going to go into the details there, but I am interested in a series of conversations she had with Taos members about their linguistic histories. And here, what you're looking at is a table that I put together based upon her field notes of the different Kiva groups at Taos Pueblo, and significantly, the languages that they were said to have spoken at the time of emergence, when they emerged into this world prior to arriving at Taos Pueblo. So these are presumably the languages they spoke when they arrived at the Taos Pueblo community and joined that growing community. And also significantly, these were languages that appear to have still been spoken in ceremonial contexts in Kiva settings. So these were languages that persisted, if not in the everyday vernacular, then at least in ceremonial contexts. There's diversity here. There were Karasan speakers who joined Taos. There were Tiwa speakers. Taos is today a Tiwa-speaking place. But look at all of the Apachean speakers, the Athabaskan speakers that comprise actually the bulk of the Kiva groups at Taos Pueblo, at least as recorded in 1906. Not just were there a lot of people whose ancestors lie in Athabascan worlds at Taos, according to these informants, they did so with a certain kind of nuance. They were, at least their presence was recorded with a certain kind of nuance in the commentary of Taos people. Some spoke Hickory Apache, they said. Others spoke Hickory Apache with a slight difference. So they're parsing the Athabascan language into different varieties. There were others who were reported to have spoke Apache, quote, but only a very, very little like the Hickory Apache. All of this speaks to what I think is actually a foundational relationship between the Apache and the Tiwa that founded what we today think of as the Pueblo communities of the Taos region, Taos and Picaries. Okay, so this is a first conclusion that I want to offer you today. By the start of the colonial period, the Southwest was already a borderlands arena of geopolitical confrontation and innovation. This is a place where people were mixing and trading ideas and developing all sorts of interesting new approaches to material culture. The southern Athapaskans, the Apache, by the time of Spanish contact, were also already savvy cultural innovators, interethnic diplomats. They were very adept at moving into new political and economic contexts, building alliances, and creatively incorporating things like Pueblo and blankets, as you can see in the image on the left here, foreign traditions into their own. All right, all of these were skills that would become especially useful once the Spanish arrive on the doorsteps of not just the Puebloan people, but also their Athabascan neighbors who were also living in the Southwest, of course, at the close of the 16th century. Right, so if this was already a complicated map, let's complicate it even further and add, for example, a few more arrows of the Spanish coming from the south during the 16th century, setting up shop at the end of the 16th century. And then as we move into the 17th and 18th century, an increasing threat by the French who were entering from the east. This is what we classically think of as the Southwest borderlands, a new 17th and 18th century world defined by interactions between Athabaskan speakers, Numic speakers, Pueblos communities, and a number of different European powers. And we're all familiar about the kinds of things that Europeans introduced into these complicated borderland spaces. We think in particular about things like metal tools. We think about wheat and other domesticates that were introduced from the old world by the Spanish into the Southwest. We especially think of the horse, which had a transformative effect, especially on plains-oriented societies like the Apache. This is an image from the mid-19th century on the left-hand side there of an Apachean individual. Okay, so showing the gun, the horse, all being incorporated into Apachean traditions. But along with horses, guns, knives, and the rest of it, the Spanish and indeed the French as well introduced new images into this region. And that's what I want to focus on in the rest of my comments this evening. striking images, images that really were unlike anything that had been produced in the indigenous Americas north of Mexico, certainly previously. What you're looking at in this image is a painting that's the Segesser II hide painting that's on display in Santa Fe. If some of you probably have seen this in the flesh, as it were, it would literally be in the flesh. This is on bison hide, of course. This is a depiction that was probably created in the early 18th century of Villesur's failed expedition onto the plains into what's today Nebraska. He was sent out there to go, capture some folks who knew what was going on with the French, bring them back to report. Villesur and his Pueblo and Apache allies who accompanied him weren't ready for what they encountered. They encountered a French, Pawnee, and Oto alliance that engaged them in battle. They were defeated. They came back, and that expedition was commemorated in this large mural, a very elaborate painted scene that engaged in historical depiction in a way, again, that really was unlike the indigenous modes of depiction that we see in rock art panels going back, into the deep past in this area. Things like actual specific historic events being commemorated graphically, so the striking of an individual, the riding on a horse over another individual, these are all legibly part of what we refer to as the history painting tradition, that goes back into medieval times. Think of all those tapestries in Europe. So this European tradition of history painting with its strong focus on the depiction of commemorative events, was introduced along with the other novelties from the old world. So too was introduced that most powerful of European symbols, the cross. The iconography of Catholicism is readily apparent in the archaeological record as well as in the archival record. It was overwhelmingly focused, of course, on Christ's cross as a central power symbol. And we know this got taken up into indigenous worlds as well. So I'll say a lot more about this in a moment, but suffice it to say that nothing like this had been seen before. And so along with the guns, germs, and steel that, Jared Diamond and others have written about so dramatically, along with all the old world plants and animals, I really want you to be thinking with me about the degree to which Europeans introduced entirely new images that had a whole historicity to them, that were about biographically depicting historical events. They introduced new aesthetic principles. These weren't static images of icons placed onto a rock or onto, hide. These had a dynamism to them. They were action scenes. And there were entirely new ways about thinking about artistic production, namely as a way of archiving historical events. All of this was brought in along with those much more written about guns, germs, steels, and the rest of it. Okay, so with all of that kind of as an introduction, let's get to the heart of the matter. Part 3, this is the substantive part of my comments this evening. I want to talk to you about Apache rock art and that question of European influence. Now, Apache rock art is little studied, and truly all of you who are volunteers out at Mesa Prieta, I and others really need your help in thinking about Athapaskan histories within the corpus of rock art that we're all collectively recording. It's not been recognized to the degree I think it should be, and to a great extent that has led the Apache to be far less visible in the archaeological record than they deserve to be. So Apache rock art has been reported on by a variety of scholars. Polly Shafsma, in her classic rock art of in New Mexico, has a section on Athabascan, Southern Athabascan rock art. I'll recommend that you all consult that once again. But Larry Lohendorf has written importantly about the presence of Athabascan rock art as he understands it. Just to the north of the area of interest tonight, his book Thunder and Herds has some really important discussions there that I draw upon heavily in my own work. And then Miles Miller, along with Larry Laurendorf and colleagues, came out recently with a volume that really helps us understand the manifestations of Athabascan rock art in southern New Mexico. So there is an emerging literature there that we can draw on. There's going to be one more added to it, I hope, pretty soon, along with my colleagues Lindsay Montgomery Darrell and Wilkinson and Ben Alberti. We've been working for years now on a book reporting on the rock art of the gorge. Soon, we'll have a whole chapter on Athabascan rock art for y'all to consult. Suffice it to say, however, that there's a lot of work to do here. And I'm going to be sharing what we think we've discovered or learned from our work in the Rio Grande Gorge, importantly in consultation with Veronica Tiller and a number of other descendant members of the Jicarilla community. So the Rio Grande Gorge, it will undoubtedly be familiar to most of you as well. It's a beautiful place. It's a rugged place. We've been conducting, my crew's been conducting surveys in the gorge since 2007 every summer. In recent years, we've been doing less and less of that as we shift our attention towards a new collaboration with Pickery's Pueblo. But I want to share with you a few sites that have generated rock art evidence that we've really become convinced are linked to Apachean heritage. And we've been convinced of this both by virtue of the appearance of the rock art itself, its stylistic similarities to Apachean rock art that's been identified in other parts of the Southwest, but importantly also its proximity to the distribution of micaceous pottery that is diagnostic of Apachean communities. So for example, here you're looking at a site that's not far from the Vista Verde site in the gorge up near the Taos Junction Bridge. We call it the Lightning Arrow site. This is a site on which there was Apachean micaceous pottery, probably from the late 18th or, the late 17th or early 18th centuries. So along with that Apache style pottery was a lot of rock art. You can see a couple of my students recording it down below. This is what it looks like on the rocks themselves, different than Puebloan rock art, different than the Comanche scratched rock art that I've presented to your community about previously. It's lightly pecked. It has outlined bodies in most cases. It's kind of hard to see in these images. We zoom in, I hope you can see here a horse and rider and a couple of shield-bearing warriors. I want to show you a couple of other images of this rock art as it looks in the field. So here we see a battle scene in progress. Another image in which we see a battle scene unfolding. This is what it looks like in the field. And this is what it looks like when it's traced and digitized. So these are our drafted images of two of those panels that we were just looking at. On the right hand, a dominant shield-bearing warrior who's confronting an unshielded individual who is shooting an arrow at him. And on the right-hand side, an individual who's mounted on his horse. He has pedestrian soldiers at his back, and he's raining down arrows on a community of seemingly defenseless individuals. This is the kind of thing that looks like the earliest examples of what Kaiser and others, refer to as the Plains biographic tradition, depictions of historical events. Significantly, we can look at this and identify things like, I'll see if my arrow works, a boat form horse, a horse without that kind of classic horse neck. This is the kind of depiction of horses that we find in the very earliest Plains biographic tradition. It's present here in the gorge, which makes a lot of sense. This is where the Apache and others got their horses from in their earliest moves towards equestrianism. Okay, and I just want to share with you a few other images from other sites in the gorge that are part of this tradition, what I think is an Athabascan tradition. So on the left-hand side, you're looking at strange creatures. They certainly have bison elements, the hump on the back, the horns, at least on the right-hand animal. On the left-hand side, things look a little stranger. We see something that kind of looks somewhere something between a bison and a horse, but it has what look like bear paws at the bottom. Regardless of those distinctive aspects, or unusual aspects, I should say, the overall form, these outlined bodies, a distinctive boat form head, This is very similar to, the horse that I shared with you just a moment ago at the Lightning Arrow site. A couple of other examples. Here's another image of a bison that's also from, a site that is referred to in the literature as the Dancing Buffalo site. It's right across from Mesa Prieta. Some of you probably know this, this beautiful panel. This is one of my favorites of the images that take part in this early Athabascan tradition, I think, in the gorge. This is up from near Arroyo Hondo. And I'm not going to tell you what I think this critter is. I'll invite you to ponder that for a moment and guess what this is an image of. It's up near the confluence of the Rio Hondo and the Rio Grande. But I hope you can see here that there is a real similarity between the head of this odd creature and the head of the, if I go back one, the horse, in the image we looked at a moment ago. It's another kind of boat form head. This is what the panel looks like out in the field. It's a complex panel. As you can see, it has graffiti on it from 1911. Underneath that graffiti are scratched Comanche imagery. There's a horse actually that's been scratched, riding the back of this strange creature that interests me. Anyway, underneath all of that, more heavily patinated, is this creature. If we were all together, I'd ask if anyone wants to raise their hand and venture a guess as to what this is. But I'll just jump to the chase and say that it's pretty clearly an armadillo, which is the first armadillo rock art panel that I know of in the area. It's a 9-banded armadillo. The distinctive band through the middle section has been depicted. I find this really fascinating because, armadillos are a southern creature. It was only with the colonial era and actually the late colonial era when water was being redirected out of the Rio Grande in significant quantities, reducing the level of the waters in the Rio Grande, that the armadillo was actually able to get across and enter into Texas and points closer to our neck of the woods. Anyway, so this would have been probably an 18th or early 19th century image of a long distance traveler who made his or her way down into northern Mexico and saw one of these very strange creatures and commemorated that on the rocks. Anyway, this is all part of what I think is a pretty clear tradition that stands apart from the Puebloan tradition. We could talk more about this in the Q&A, but most significant about this tradition is that it really focuses on battle scenes, on historical events, presumably battles that actually happened. These seem to be commemorative in nature. There's a real focus on military action. This was unprecedented in the rock art traditions of the region. It appears with the earliest depictions of horses. It's clearly colonial era. We don't find anything like it in the pre-colonial times. And it really begs the question of how we should understand this. What was the impetus for this massive shift, this really significant aesthetic shift, artistic shift in indigenous iconographic production? Well, I hope I've already laid the groundwork for the answer to that question. I think this is it. I think images like this, which were not just introduced by the Spanish during this time period, but were actually part of the dynamics of interaction between Spanish and indigenous communities. This Sigesser II hide painting, detail of which we're looking at again here, was probably produced at the behest of a Spaniard, but with indigenous labor. It was probably painted by indigenous artists who had been trained in Spanish aesthetics and techniques. This is something that was being done in Mexico. It was probably replicated in the Southwest. And so there was a clear way in which there was a training of indigenous artists to depict in European style ways, this mode of history painting. This was also the kind of image, dramatic, bold image about a battle involving Apache people who were then allied with the Spanish that would have been shown around. This is the kind of thing that Apache individuals probably would have looked at and said, wow, this is a dramatic way of thinking about how images can work. This is another of those Segesser hide paintings. This is a detail of a sprawling scene from the Segesser 1 hide painting. We don't know exactly what battle is being depicted here, but it seems to be an attack actually on an Apache compound by a number of Spanish auxiliaries, indigenous auxiliaries of the Spanish. It was probably something that took place right after the Spanish returned following the Pueblo Revolt period. So it's late 17th or early 18th century. And here too, we see, a commemoration of a battle taking place. I want to highlight one detail of that detail for you because it's, it gives us this kind of image of a mounted warrior reaching out and striking, touching an enemy opponent. This is the kind of thing where it's produced within a fully indigenous world that we would describe as counting coup. However, it's an image, that was produced, at the request of a Spanish leader. Again, maybe by indigenous artists, but nevertheless for Spanish consumption. It would have been designed and created to be sent back to decorate a wall in Europe. And I don't think it's hard to imagine that this kind of image, served as a kind of motivation or inspiration for the new forms of Athapaskan depiction that we just looked at. So just to give you one quick comparison, if we take that Segesser 1 image and compare it with a rock art panel from the Gorge, this being another Apachean rock art panel, I think, what we're looking at actually is, a simplified version of a battle in process. On the left-hand side of that rock art panel, we're looking at a mounted warrior who is falling over backwards. This is a vanquished foe within the Plains biographic tradition. That's how you would interpret it. So there's a story here to tell. But look especially on the right-hand side. What you're seeing is a shield-bearing warrior on not just a horse, but an armored horse. This is the same kind of horse armor, albeit made with hide rather than metal, that we see up in the upper left-hand side. The Spaniards introduced horses as well as horse armor. The Apache were one of the few groups that were known to have armored their horses modeled on Spanish armor. It was only during the kind of early 18th century when this happened, but we see this depicted in their rock art. And indeed, some of those other images that we just looked at in which battles are being depicted and folks are reaching out to strike their enemies, this I read now as having been inspired perhaps directly by European modes of history painting that were being introduced right around the same time period in military contexts. And we can imagine this being something that began to circulate within Athabascan worlds. Certainly Spanish Apache interactions were robust long before the Europeans were, tangling with other native groups in the area. The Athapaskans, the Apache, were both important allies and fearsome opponents of the Spanish. So I'm imagining, history painting as being taken up by the Apache first, but we can easily see it transferring over, leaping over into other artistic traditions. I'm sharing with you here in the bottom right a couple of rock art panels that I've spoken about before that I and my colleagues affiliate with the ancestral Comanche. These are images of people reaching out and striking opponents. Again, I see this all really as a playing out of a certain kind of European aesthetic logic that was reappropriated, taken up for new purposes in indigenous worlds. And we can trace this all the way up and down the continent. In the upper right-hand side here, I'm showing you an image from Alberta. This is probably a Blackfoot image. It's the same sort of thing. It's probably has a similar kind of genealogical root in European history painting, transferred through native hands, now again being used to commemorate battles of indigenous folks against other indigenous folks. Okay, so I'm really interested in this rock art and how we think about it. It displays historical action. This is characteristic of the biographic tradition. But just as importantly as the raw presentation of events, historical events, are all of these complex pictorial shorthands that also got deployed, within this kind of art. So here you're seeing an image. This is also from an extension of that Dancing Buffalo site that again, some of you know, right across the river from Mesa Prieta. And we're looking at a shield-bearing warrior significantly wielding a broadsword that the Apache were known to go into battle with, actually, having stolen them from their colonizers and using those tools against them. So we probably have an Apachean individual on the right who's vanquished a headless individual on the left-hand side there. But all around them are these complicated symbols that we struggle to understand. Some of them we could interpret via the Plains biographic tradition conventions more generally, like that hatchet above the shield-bearing warrior probably signifies a weapon that he captured from his enemy in the fray. But many of these we struggle to understand. Surely they had significance. Okay, so there's historical action, but also a complex use of these shorthands, graphic shorthands, as well as a new urge to tally accomplishments, not just depict them, but create a kind of quantitative tally of what took place. So here's another image that we affiliate with the Apache. It too was found, as have been all of the Apachean rock art panels that I've shared with you. It's directly associated with Apache-style micaceous pottery out there in the gorge. What you're looking at are, some anthropomorphic forms, one of which is clearly a shield-bearing warrior. The others we could spend a lot of time talking about. There's interesting details there to discuss. But more than that, I want to draw your attention to the left-hand side of this rock art panel, in which we find, 20-some horses being depicted, not really in action, but almost as a list. It's as if the artist is saying, this is how many horses we captured, in our foray into this area, along with 4 anthropomorphic figures who are headless. In the bottom left, it's not hard to imagine that these were folks who were killed in the battle that this image commemorates. This isn't action per se. It's a tally that references action. And that too is also quite new. The inspiration for this, the tallies, you might ask. Well, okay, we need to look more deeply into the colonial interactions to understand the origin of things like tally marks. What I'm sharing with you here is a 1786 tally sheet that really sheds some light on this, I think. I'm going to translate the text on here for you. This is, as is written at the top, the tally sheet, a tally sheet which Governor Anza sent in blank on the 19th of May, 1786, to the Comanche captain, Capa. This was at a moment when the Comanche and the Spanish had just entered into a bold new alliance. Effectively, the Apache stopped being the key allies of the Spanish, and the Comanche became key allies, and the Apache suddenly became enemies of the state. So it was a shifting in the geopolitics of the area. As one of the first things that the Comanche had to do was to go off in battles against the Apache and to bring these tally sheets with them. Okay, so this was given to the Comanche captain so that there might be indicated on it, by means of lines and signs, the chiefs who might set out on the campaign in the expedition under his command against the Apaches, the number of men which each detachment may be composed, and the successes that might be achieved. So the governor wants to keep track of what's going on out there. It's kind of nerve-wracking sending off indigenous auxiliaries to do the work of empire for you. This was the kind of bureaucratic underpinnings of that. The key thing here is that it was Spaniards who were requesting that indigenous folks make tally marks on pieces of paper and hide for them so that they knew what the heck was going on. The details here are important. Things like horseshoes are used to symbolize captured horses. And I'm really intrigued by these symbols, this kind of keyhole shape. If it's right side up, it signifies the number of Apache that were killed, we're told here, or if it's upside down, the number of Apache that are captured. I've been doing a lot of research into this. I think these are actually stylized scapula, which have a really interesting story behind them, but I won't take the time to share that with you now. Anyway, I want to show you one more of these tally sheets. This is, I share with you thanks to Joaquin Revilla Martinez, a really wonderful friend and colleague of mine, historian, who brought this to my attention. This is a 1768 tally, 67 tally. Did I get that right? Yes, 1787, pardon me. 1 year after the Comanche-Spanish peace, 1 year after the tally sheet that we were just looking at. Significantly, this seems to have been produced by a Comanche individual. And then we see Anza, actually the governor, sticking this onto a sheet of paper and annotating it himself. So what you're looking at on the right there are his annotations. He's labeled the tally sheet. This is his explanation of the preceding characters that he had drawn onto the tally sheet. It's signed by him in 1787, and it tells a story. This is, a tally sheet composed by a Comanche leader that tells a story of the captain, Isipampi, who was the commander of the expedition. He was accompanied by 95 Comanche warriors who went out into battle and succeeded in killing 5 Apache warriors. It's documented. They captured 35 of Apache of both sexes, we're told, as well as 16 Apache horses. This sheet, this pictographic document, also tells us that during the expedition, 1 Comanche died, 6, so Anza says, although I'm still having struggle seeing that as a tally of 6, 6 Comanche were wounded, and 8 Comanche horses were also wounded. So, this is the kind of thing that the Comanche were being asked to produce for the Spanish. Surely, when the Spanish were allied with the Apache, similar sorts of tallies were requested. We just don't have those preserved in the archival record. The notion that this kind of tallying would have quickly leapt over from Spanish indigenous relationships into fully indigenous worlds is not at all hard to imagine. I share with you on the right-hand side here, this is a Comanche, not an Apache rock art panel. This we found up near the confluence of the Rio Hondo and the Rio Grande. It's a tally, right? It looks very similar to the kind of thing that we're seeing, on paper, on parchment rather, on the left. I can't interpret a lot of the symbols here. I wish that we had, Anza's narration of it from the 18th century. But this was, I think, produced for indigenous eyes by indigenous artists. They were appropriating the notion of tallying for their own purposes. In fact, some of those specific symbols we actually find in the rock art. This is down near the Rio Pueblo, Rio Grande confluence. This is one of those keyhole shapes, which for a long time, I couldn't interpret this sort of thing. Found it abraded onto the rock. It fits in stylistically or technologically into the Comanche rock art tradition. But what's that keyhole shape on the rock doing? Well, it looks like what's being indicated here was a killed Apache, an individual. Just as they were asked to do it for the Spanish, so too were they documenting these kinds of conquests on the rocks for themselves. Okay, returning to Apache and rock art, I think that's what this is. I think this is a tally, and I think the Apache were some of the earliest to engage in this sort of activity, and only later did the Comanche and other Plains tribes really, run with it. Okay, so my third conclusion, I'm scurrying towards the end here, is that militarism, was not just an important theme in Athabascan and more broadly speaking, Plains visual culture. I think military interactions, alliances, and this sort of thing were a key way in which certain ideas regarding aesthetic depiction and the documentation of historical events, a key space in which these ideas were shared and transferred from European to indigenous worlds. Okay, I have one more set of examples that I'd like to share with you, and we'll see how quickly I can get through those. It wasn't just all fighting. There was a lot of fighting, clearly. I mean, colonialism is a violent process. But there was also a lot of exchange of religious ideas, and that's what I really want to end with this evening. Religious imagery and what's known in the Athabascan literatures as the mountain spirit tradition, effectively the Athabascan equivalent of the Kachina tradition in the Puebloan world. We know about the rock art of the mountain spirit tradition from work that's been conducted in other parts of New Mexico. So I'm referring you here to a really wonderful rock art report that came out in 2016 by Margaret Barrier, depicting clearly mountain spirit dancers as they're known, ethnographically and into recent times within various Apachean groups. This from down near Deming. Again, here you're looking at a photograph by Edward Curtis in 1906. It's clear what we're looking at here. These dancers are representations of important spirits within Apachean worlds. I won't go into the esoteric details. It's not my place to do that, nor do I have the background to do that. Suffice it to say that they're present in the rock art. We can look to Western New Mexico. This is from the Gila region. Aaron Wright published this image. It's painted on the rocks. But again, we see that, trident headdress that is classically one of those mountain spirit headdress forms. And here from South Central New Mexico, this by Miller et al. This is a great rock art panel. They clearly identify it with the Apache. Absolutely, it shows all sorts of characteristic elements, but I draw your attention in particular to this floating headdress above the shield bearer, the classic trident. This is a very clear mountain spirit image. I want to show you just in the final 5 minutes or so some examples that we found in the Rio Grande Gorge. This is a site just above Pilar that we've consulted with the Hickory Apache Tribal Historic Preservation Office with, who've really helped us understand a number of images, including this rock art panel, which was explicitly identified as an image related to Apachean puberty ceremonies, initiation ceremonies for young women. This panel was not explained to us in depth, but it was flagged as an important panel. So too was this one, both linked to puberty rites. We were grateful for that information. In our own documentation of it, we've sought to understand this in Athabascan terms as best we could. And in doing so, we've been really, really impressed by how much detail was put into these panels by the Athabascan ancestors out here. This is a pair of panels that appears very close to one another at this site overlooking Pilar. Each panel centers on an anthropomorphic figure. You can see that they're gendered quite differently. On the left-hand side, perhaps we are looking at the woman, the initiate herself, who was identified as being at the center of these panels, or the logic of these panels. Again, we were told that this had to do with the puberty rites of young women at by the ancestors, among the ancestors. And so perhaps that is the woman herself being depicted. It's hard to claim that about the image on the right-hand side. That's a phallus quite clearly between the legs of that individual. But all of this actually makes sense if you start to look into the puberty ceremonies of the Apache, this all-important ceremony that really brought a woman into a young girl into womanhood and kind of gave her the blessings to take her forward in the world. It makes sense because that ceremony, what Morris Oppler referred to as the adolescent rite, really centered on not just a young maiden, but also her accompanying boy. They went hand in hand through everything. So this is a quote from one of Oppler's studies. The boy is so completely an equal partner, he writes in the event, and its benefit, that I hesitated to call the event a girl's puberty ceremony and end by simply labeling it the adolescent rite. So, it's not just a girl's puberty ceremony, it's a boys and girls. And it seems the rock art is actually signifying this for us. Let's then go forward identifying the figure on the left as a pubescent girl, on the right, the accompanying boy who was selected from the community to be with her during every stage of this ceremony. We could even go further and think with Athabaskan ethnography and the ongoing commentary of tribal members to recognize that these two figures are not just initiates into the community, they also stand for culture heroes. In the girl's case, a white shell woman. In the boy's case, monster slayer. These are important figures within Athabaskan thought. Here too, I won't go into the esoteric details. But suffice it to say, they're surrounded in the imagery here by various other symbols that are significant to mountain spirit tradition. Teepees, which figure prominently in the ceremony, quartered circles, which are an important Apachean symbol. These are present with, let's imagine, the female panel. On the male side, significantly, we find a few images that we had originally imagined were cruciform images that looked like a globus cruciger. Actually, we thought it looked like a Catholic, stylized Catholic, cross on a globe. This we were corrected. We were corrected in this, interpretation immediately by the Hickory Tribal Historic Preservation officers. They said, no, these are mountain spirit headdresses. This makes sense, right? We've already seen some of these images. That classic trident form is documented very nicely in Curtis's photograph. We see it in other rock art. And so what we see with the male figure are mountain spirit reference. And this makes sense because indeed mountain spirit dancers were men. It's a masculine undertaking, and we could say that it makes sense that it would appear alongside that masculine anthropomorph. Okay, so what we're looking at here, I think, in the gorge is a commemoration of ceremonies that were once held in Pilar, likely by the Hickory ancestors during a time when they still practiced the mountain spirit tradition. Today, those mountain spirit dancers are no longer part of their active practices. So something like this. This is from the National Museum of the American Indian, from Fort Sill. It was a drawing. These are the kind of ceremonies we'd imagine going on in the gorge with mountain spirit dancers honoring and helping bring into womanhood, a young girl after her, first menstruation. I want to share with you one other panel. This is the last of the rock art panels that I want to walk you through. This is also, I think, an Athabaskan Apache, an ancestral Apache image is down from that site across from Mesa Prieta, the Dancing Buffalo site. And it has a lot of iconography that speaks more directly towards that interplay between Catholicism, introduced by the Spanish, and the emergent mountain spirit tradition within Athabascan worlds. This is our tracing of that panel, and you see a lot of images here, a lot of symbols, some of them that seem like they very comfortably fit within an indigenous tradition, others that look classically Catholic. If we look on the right-hand side, we see two dancing figures. They have either a trident or a cruciform headdress. These look very similar to the mountain spirit dancers that we've seen in other parts of New Mexico rock art, assemblages. It also looks like, known mountain spirit dancers in more recent times. We see a morning star glyph along with a crescent moon. These are classic symbols that are employed within Athabascan, visual culture. But if we look to the left-hand side, we see very different sorts of glyphs. On one end, we see a Pueblo IV-style dragonfly. This is the kind of thing that you see in mural arts of the Pueblos. Some people have described it as a kind of hybrid Catholic/indigenous icon. Very well could be interpreted that way here too. But setting that aside, we find a lot of classic Latin crosses as well. These all seem to be pecked in the same hand on this panel. So how are we to interpret, the complexity here? It seems to gesture towards that mountain spirit tradition of mass dancers, but it also incorporates some very clear Catholic imagery. Well, I'm not going to read this to you in the interest of time, but suffice it to say that one of the few historians or ethnographers that have looked at this issue, here I'm referring to Thomas Larson's dissertation work from 1996, they've noted that there's actually no dissonance between the idea of, in this case, the Mescalero Apache um, incorporating Catholic images, crucifixes and the rest of it into their mountain spirit dancing ceremonies. This from the late 20th century is a commentary that says, we're all Catholics. There's no tension between that fact and our mountain spirit traditions. Okay, we could think about that as a hybridization that is relatively recent, but I actually want to draw you back, and here the text does matter, I think, to Benavides' 1630 memorial, in which he traveled throughout the Southwest and commented on its residents, and especially their engagement with Catholicism. And I want to share with you one story from within his 1630 memorial as a way of moving towards a conclusion. He writes in 1630, while I was on my way to this Pueblo, the Pueblo of the Gila Apache, to instruct its inhabitants, their captain learned of it and came 14 leagues to the Pueblo of San Antonio de Senecu to meet me. He took out a folded gamusa, that is a tanned deerskin, and he presented it to me. I told him, this was an Apache individual presenting it to Benavides. I told him that he already knew I did not want them to give me anything, that all I wanted of them was that they should adore the Lord of heaven and earth with all of their hearts. Right, I'm sure that's all the Spanish wanted. Smiling, he told me to unfold the gamusa so that I could see what it contained. Okay, this is apparently what it contained. He did so and observed that it was very white and large, and that in the middle of it there was a sun painted green, surmounted by a cross. And that under the sun there was a moon painted dark and gray and likewise surmounted by a cross. We don't have an image of it depicted for us in Benavides' memorial, but it looked probably something like this. And although I got some idea of its significance, I asked him, Benavides writes, the meaning of that painting. He replied thus, farther, until now we had not known any benefactors as great as the sun and the moon. But now that you have taught us that that God is the Lord and creator of the sun and moon and of all things, and that the cross is the sign of God, I have ordered the cross painted over the sun, over the moon, so that you will understand that we do what you teach us. And above all, that we do not forget to adore God and his holy cross. Okay, take that with a grain of salt. This is a Spanish translation of someone speaking in Athabascan, probably saying very different words, but this was how it was written down. I accept that there was a kind of taking up of the cross within Athabascan worlds, creatively redeploying it alongside their own symbolism and icons. This I take to be a truth from Benavides' memorial. And in fact, we can look to one final rock art panel from the gorge. This is from up near the Vista Verde site. I think this too is probably an Athabascan panel. It's got the quartered circle, important Athapaskan glyph, but also, interestingly enough, a sun surmounted by a cross that's been added above it. Who knows if this is the same sort of thing that Benavides compatriots were creating, but I find it telling. Okay, so here's the final conclusion. Beyond simple questions of missionization, beyond the imposition of Catholicism on native peoples in the Southwest, Apachean communities really across the landscape, they really appear to have willingly appropriated that power symbol of the Catholics, the cross, elaborating it, indigenizing it, placing it into the headdresses of their mountain spirit dancers, integrating it into their ceremonial life, a creative appropriation of the colonizers' things. Okay, I'm looking and it's 10 after 9 my time, which means it's 10 after 7 o'clock your time. And so I'm not going to offer too many concluding thoughts, except to say that the study of borderland images, both in the pre-colonial period, as we look at the interaction between different indigenous groups, and during the colonial era, as we think about the interactions between Europeans and indigenous groups, this is a crucial issue for us as rock art specialists to think through. So frequently we long to attach a panel to a particular ethnic identity. I want to push back against that, not to stop us from identifying panels as ethnically linked. It's important, I think, to say this is an Apache hand that created this panel, or this is a Comanche hand that created this panel. But to recognize that what Apache is, what Comanche is, what Spanish is, was a moving target. These were dynamic ethnic identities that incorporated creatively, both their allies and their enemies' visual culture and ideas. And this is really what culture is. This is what history is. And so studying all images as borderland images, that's, I think, where we need to go in rock art studies, at least in this little corner of North America. And so I'll leave that with you as a final thought. But I do want to just give you some further reading for your own studies to learn more about the really fascinating and important history of Apache in the Taos region, that a region I've been sharing with you images of tonight. I really, really strongly encourage you to go purchase and closely read both Veronica Tiller's important text, The Hickory Apache: A History, Sunday Alsout's beautiful Becoming White Clay, seminal text now in Apache archaeology studies. And I'm really happy to report the recent publication of Lindsay Montgomery's new book, just came out hot off the presses, A History of Mobility in New Mexico, Mobile Landscapes and Persistent Places. Lindsay is extremely attentive to the stories of communities like the Apache and Ute right there in the Taos region. Pick that up before they're sold out. And with that and those recommendations, I'll thank you again for the invitation to speak, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
All right. Welcome, and thank you, Seb. That was an absolutely amazing talk, and I, for one, am definitely going to purchase a copy of Lindsay's book as soon as this is over. I don't know how many folks in the audience have had a chance to attend any of Lindsay's talks, either in person or online, but she does some fantastic research, definitely an up-and-coming scholar in this region, so definitely take Seb's advice. I just about laughed out loud, Seb, when you mentioned the numic spread, because so many dissertations have been focused on this, and I don't think we're any closer to a consensus than before that.
Not at all.
So yeah, we have a number of audience questions here, and I'll start with let's see here. Carol Patterson brings up the possibility of Apache rock art in the Uinta Basin that predates the quote-unquote numic entrada into that region. Can you say anything to that?
I can say that the numic entrada, that's even funnier to me than numic spread. That's great. I don't know if that was Carol's terms or not, but I should have flagged Carol's work. She's given some talks recently that with great frustration, I've not been able to attend. And so I don't think we can actually talk back and forth, Carol, but I'm really looking forward to the time when I can sit down with you and learn from everything that you've been studying up north. That's part of this story. I would love to, be able to link the colonial rock art that really is my focus in the Taos region with pre-colonial Athabascan rock art further north. There are some elements that I've taken from Larry Lohendorf's work. For example, there are things like, outline bodies. Stipple fill, actually, I think is something that, connects up Athabascan rock art in some, portions of that northern zone. I've struggled to really, because so much of the attention has been given to Ute rock art up in that area, your work being really important in that respect as well. I've struggled to get a handle on how people are thinking about the difference between Ute and Apache rock art, ancestral Ute and ancestral rock art, Apache rock art up there. So yeah, all I can say is that I want to learn from you about that. It's too bad that, that rock art hasn't been able to be mobilized more effectively in this larger question of the Athabascan migrations from the north. I think that there's untapped, potential there, but it requires us looking at rock art traditions across a range of areas, and we're very bad frequently about developing databases that speak across areas. I find that to be one of the great limitations of a lot of rock art research, my own included. Anyway, I wish I had a better answer for you. I just am looking forward to a point where we can bring all these databases together into one massive centralized place to explore things like the Athabaskan migration south.
I've definitely got something to say about that once we go off air. All right, so next we've got, let's see here, and forgive me if I pronounce this wrong, So Justus asked about, so we've covered some of the Spanish and even French influences, but what about Jewish influences?
That's really cool. I haven't found any Jewish influences, although in the rock art, I should say. That's not to say that we haven't found Jewish rock art, that is really, a source of great fascination for myself and others who, who have would like to know more about this history. Sadly, one of the folks who I could have learned a great deal from, passed away a few years ago. Thomas Atencio wrote a great deal about the, crypto-Jewish tradition. He passed away right as I had moved into the little community of Dixon. So I didn't have a chance to learn from him about this topic. I did spend many years in dialogue with Felipe Ortega, who was a really important mentor for Sunday Eiselt, a good friend of Dick Ford, who was both Sunday and my advisors. I learned a certain amount from Felipe about those complicated, entangled histories. He did talk about Jewish influences on his own identity as a Hickory, a two-spirit man. So I don't doubt that there are some roots and some threads to follow there. I must admit I haven't been looking for it in the rock art record. It might be quite difficult to find, but it's something that's worth looking for. So I thank you for that question, and yeah, you've given us something else to do.
And interesting you bring up Felipe Ortega, because there are still folks who learned potting from Felipe, particularly that very brilliant, dazzling micaceous pottery. And so since you were talking about how that micaceous pottery is diagnostic of Athapaskans, definitely for folks who aren't familiar with Mr. Ortega, a lot of his work is actually up on YouTube, and like I said, there are potters who still practice his techniques. So yeah, I actually have a comment or question here. So Sev, you brought up the Dancing Buffalo site, and yeah, this is kind of where our research areas overlap a little bit. I just used some examples from that site of probable macaw images for my Aurora talk. So just had to stick that in there.
That's great. No, it's an amazing site.
Absolutely. All right, so Carol Patterson has another question, although that one might have gotten answered in the chat, and that question was simply horse or elk.
Sorry, what was horse or elk for, what's the reference there?
I believe this is, was this referring to the images themselves or to the hides that the images were on? It might be referring to the hides.
Gosh, I'm sorry. I'm having a hard time. Perhaps it's because it's 20 after 9 over here that I'm a little deaf right now. So sorry, what was it? Was the question? What type of hide were the images produced on? Is this the Gesser hide paintings, or? The
question was simply horses or elk, and I'm trying to load.
Maybe that was in reference. Maybe that's following on another thread in the chat. I don't know.
Yeah, possibly. So we'll move on. And Carol, sorry about that. We'll try to put you folks in contact if that goes unanswered. Okay, so next question is from Paula Lazar. which is, if the Spanish were training local natives in art, why does it seem that only the Apache and not the Pueblos were doing petroglyphs in this style?
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, there are, I think, Pueblo artists who were creating rock art that, was influenced by the Spanish iconographic, tradition. So I don't think that it's that there's a lack of influences there. Certainly, if we think to Pueblo pottery, so much of it took up, European design aesthetics, partially because Pueblo folks were, of course, making pots to, for Spanish consumers. So it's not like we don't know that there was a great deal of creative influence. And let me just say, of course, that the influence goes both ways. There was, as much, creative appropriation of indigenous, foods and tools and images by, the colonizers as the other way around. That said, if we're thinking strictly about rock art, there really are, I think, differences in the way in which, rock art played out over the colonial period, in Puebloan communities vis-a-vis, Athabascan communities, vis-a-vis, Comanche and other Numic speaking communities. Partly I'm thinking about the way the missionary project was located within Puebloan communities. And along with that missionary project came a cracking down on certain forms of image production. So I remember talking to Polly Shafsma about this, and she's been told by friends at Taos that traditionally it's thought that only witches made rock art. Okay, I'm pretty sure that wasn't a traditional way of thinking about rock art production, but surely the influence of missionaries up in the Taos area. So I think there was a crackdown on certain forms of image production in Pueblo communities, precisely because that's where the missions were. I think that, more nomadic, mobile communities, had more freedom to produce in different ways. But in terms of the historicity of the images, in thinking about the biographic nature of these images, which comes to be so characteristic of plains communities, not just Apache or Comanche, but, running all the way up the plains corridor. I really see that as being linked to a new and distinctively plains way of thinking about how you build prestige, how you interact socially with other members of your group, how you compete with the members of other groups as equestrian, strongly militarized, folks. So, they were creating these, indigenous versions of history painting as a way of establishing, their prestige within the group. So I went out and performed bravely on the battlefield to make that accomplishment, that counted coup, real. I need to draw it, paint it onto my vestments. I need to paint it onto my teepee. I need to draw it onto the rocks. And I need to have everyone else say, yes, indeed, that's what happened. Once it becomes, materialized, crystallized in that way, it becomes socially real and able to be mobilized in political ways. So, I think that there were a lot of good reasons for producing these biographic images in plain societies. In Puebloan worlds, there was a very different way of thinking about politics, that was, deeply linked to, Kiva societies, priestly orders. It really wasn't about bragging about what you did on the battlefield, quite the opposite. There's a real enforced humility to leadership, the aesthetics and style of leadership in the Puebloan world. So, history painting is a kind of idiom that went well with powerful warriors. Not so with the, more theocratic organization of the Pueblos.
And interesting that you brought in the influence, particularly on the Pueblos, of how Christianization might have led to the production of rock art to become taboo. And I think that kind of one ties in with one of your examples, and two, there's a very interesting chapter in a book that you actually wrote I believe it was the preface or introduction to, that came out this year, Ontologies of Rock Art. That's another book that I encourage everyone to get a copy of. This is a great book, but in particular, I believe it was Wilkinson. Let's see here. Yeah, Daryl Wilkinson wrote about Christian images in actually this same area in this canyon. So yeah, that was a good chapter, and of course I liked your introduction, so folks should check that out too.
You should read everything that Daryl writes. Daryl, is a close collaborator. So is Lindsay, and so is Ben Alberti. We all have been working together for a very long time. So, yeah, no, half of what I say is a product of Daryl's mind. The other half is product of Lindsay's mind, and Ben's in there too. So
that's a wonderful circle. I think that also kind of transitions into our next question by, again, sorry if I mispronounced this, Lee Recca asks, rock art or rock writing? So that's a loaded question. Do you want to take that?
Yeah, it's interesting that, rock art is the term that we use. Everybody wrings their hands over the word art, though. Fair enough. I tend to be fine with using the word art. I get much more worried about the language we use when it, denies, indigenous communities of the kind of prestige discourse of the West. So, and we think of, white Western European sort of history as something that produced art. And I like the idea of saying that others produced art in very different ways, So I don't have a problem with the category of art, actually. I would like to see things like native science be appreciated as well. I think, there's Western science, but there are other kinds of science too. Anyway, writing is another one of those words. I'm not actually, that's a fraught conversation. It's entirely reasonable, I think, to say that there are other ways of thinking about, writing and reading. And there are some really important conversations, that have been had about not just, the Plains biographic tradition as a form of colonial era indigenous writing, but rock art in pre-colonial times, as being a form of writing as well. Yeah, in a general sense, yes. Depends on how specific we're using that word writing. I do think that there's a narrative aspect to the biographic tradition that is very distinctive. It can be read out, and there are some conventions that really feel like they have a lot to do with the kinds of arbitrary signs that are deployed in writing. I have to say that it would take a long time to kind of really treat this topic thoroughly, but the most interesting answer that I could offer you there is that the rock art imagery that we've considered is a form of writing insofar as it's linked to the plain sign language tradition. And I didn't get into that in my comments, but there's a whole way in which the gestural language, the sign language that has been well documented from the colonial period on the plains, which surely has indigenous components. I mean, there are always sign languages that have been deployed, right? The gestures that one makes in signing, are actually pretty similar to some of the gestures that we see the traces of on the rocks. So, for example, like you could make a horse that has a kind of two-arced bounce to it. This is one of the conventional ways of depicting a horse in Comanche rock art. That bouncing sign is actually a hand gesture for many as well. And so in the same moment, you get horse and many horses. So there's an interplay between the gestural movement of the hand when making rock art and the images that are left on the rock. And so, I guess, one answer to your question is to say there's a lot that has to do with writing bound up in this, But I think we need to look beyond the rocks themselves to think about the gestural practices that created them, which I think was, part of a sign language tradition, and to the oral performances that would, be enacted, that were prompted by the images. Anyway, it's really interesting. It's, this little cluster of scholars that I work with in our introduction to this book we've been working on forever. There's a whole section on word versus image, and well, hopefully that'll shed some light when we're done with it. Thanks for that question. That's a real interesting one.
Absolutely. And if I can quickly add on, since the Namak are in play, this is a question that's been floating around since the 19th century. Herbert Mallory was funded by the U.S. government to investigate the idea if there was actually a hieroglyphic writing system in the U.S. And by the 1890s, he had concluded, well, it's not technically hieroglyphs, but he proposed this idea of mythograms, which seems to tie in very well with this later biographical style, in that you've got a narrative that's depicted in the images, with the images functioning as mnemonics to sort of prompt that story.
No, totally. Mallory was also, he was deeply invested in the connection between sign language and image production. He was the one who really pioneered that. And then, folks really kind of left that behind as a kind of, antiquated longing to be able to read images. That idea was discarded too quickly. When you actually go back to the 19th century and read some of those kind of early, especially American military folks, who are out there, engaged with plains folks, oftentimes in violent ways, but sometimes as allies. There's a lot of reading of images going on in a way that feels very, very much like the reading of text. So we discarded that question far too early, and I think now we're poised to return to it in an interesting way.
All right. So I'm just checking really quickly if there's any questions left in the chat. For some reason, this isn't displaying here in chronological order, so I hope we got to your questions. Let's see here. I did see Steve Ivey shared a link to a website for powwows and the scheduling of powwows. It's been unfortunate that we haven't been able to see these during the pandemic, but hopefully Gathering of Nations happens next year. It looks like it's still on. And then Steve also says, thanks so much. He had to run over, but we'll catch the end later. So Steve, we got to your questions and comments. So thank you for tuning in. And let's see here. Yeah, I think that's about it. Any closing comments?
None for me, but thanks again. The work that you all do at Mesa Prieta is so crucial. So I'm really grateful for all the work you're doing, and it was a pleasure. Even though I couldn't see anybody during this whole talk or see their comments, it's nice to know that there were a few people out there.
Yeah, and I really do hope our volunteers tuned in, because you provided so many ways of identifying potentially Athabascan images that they may not have been aware of. At least some of these points I wasn't aware of before watching this talk. So thank you very much for your knowledge. So one more reminder to our audience. Carly said that there will be an apple harvest festival at Los Luceros Historic Site. So go over, check that out, get some apples. It's a pretty big orchard, so they're going to need help with that. Thank you again to Severin Fowles and to Carly and to Ethan Ortega and everyone over there at Los Luceros. I think that's all that we've got for you tonight. Y'all take care, and we'll see you next month. Oh, and one last plug for Chat with the Archaeologist. That's going to be Friday afternoon on the 8th, second Friday of the month, and that will be with David Witt. He's an archaeoacoustics researcher at Chaco, and his day job is in the state of New York. And I just want to check to make sure if this is All right. So I just wanted to make sure that wasn't a question coming into me. So thank you all. See you next month.